So what is your name?
Jim Donnelly.
And why did you join the Navy?
I came out of I graduated from high school, and fellow neighborhood people that I knew had been out of high school 2 and 3, if not 4 years, and no work. They didn't have a job. So I said, well, I better look around to get on the payroll, and I ended up, because I influenced by others, to go in the Navy, and have never had to apologize for it since. I spent just shy of 10 years in the Navy, and came out and went to work for the federal government. My service number is somewhat unique, 2020202. And many of my fellow comrades from the Emmons, we would line up because, as an example, Chereau, who passed on last year, the year before, he was 01, so he stood in front of me, and it was interesting. I can remember the day of the christening of the ship, quite a ceremony, but they didn't have anybody from Washington. It was the local Navy Yard commander, the captain, that was the principal speaker. And we did all right. I remember leaving the Navy Yard in a panic many times for reports, true or false, that, as example, submarines had popped up somewhere nearby, and all the yard workmen would be ordered off the ship, and then we would pitch their tools out on the dock or overboard, whichever you're inclined to think. You've probably heard about our first series of cruises. We went to South America, and we left the Navy Yard and went to Bermuda. From Bermuda, we ended up in Panama, through the canal, and headed for Lima, Peru. We went to all the principal countries in Lima, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and finally, after 2 or 3 months, we turned around and came back. And then we went all the way down to I'm getting old if I can't remember the places that we went. And the buildup of the Navy was on, and what I recall about that sail was the fact that we went over the equator, had quite a ceremony because you become shellback, and ended up with an award, a photograph, beautiful, with the date and your name and rating. When we got back, we stopped off again in Bermuda to put ashore all of the stuff that would be called burnable if we got hit. And after the war, we went back there to pick up, it was put in a locker, and padlock and so on. We were gone. And it was fellow shipmates from other ships that came in and pilfered the material. It was a wonderful experience, and I still am in touch with a great many of my shipmates. And we were very proud of the ship. It was the Bath Iron Works built boat. And they had a reputation of being the best in the Navy. If a Bath built boat Well, we ended up back in the Charlestown Navy Yard, which, by the way, was the destroyer yard. I can remember many of the destroyers that were there. We saw months later in the North Atlantic, and those that didn't even survive. The USS Buck was lost in the Mediterranean. The similar design destroyer in the convoy, one of the convoys that we participated, they had merchant seamen in the water, and they turned on their big 36-inch searchlight, would turn night into day, but it always left a white ring around the outside, and they hadn't had it on but seconds when they were torpedoed. We used to see sailors from the Reuben chains, because of all of that winter gear, the flat hat, most of them had the name of the ship. That's all gone. They ended up just having U.S. Navy in the end. And we had the distinction of going to Panama and bringing back many of the vessels that were beat up in the Pacific. As an example, quite a bit of publicity was Battleship X. Roosevelt, the president, would not give the name of the vessel out, and we picked her up in Panama and brought her into the New York Navy Yard for repairs. She'd been repeatedly hit with 5-inch shells, and took a hit on the top of turret 2. And I was very familiar with the turret captain, and that concussion drove his head between his legs, and he straightened out and was fine thereafter. I couldn't believe how those 16-inch battleships were built. 14 have brought 16-inch of armor plating on the sides, same thing on top and so forth. You couldn't believe that they couldn't take a tremendous beating and still not sink. We went to North Africa for the first invasion, and our station was with cheap, small carriers off of north of Casablanca, but in fact we turned around and went into Casablanca. It was a Sunday, church services if you were inclined to go to church. And I can remember sitting there looking up in the holes in the roof of the church where the bombs had been. They had a battleship, the Jean Bart. My battle station was above the pilot house, and I was up there with the fellow, a lieutenant that ran the bakery at First National grocery stores, big grocery store. We could hear the shells passing overhead, and found out later that they were shooting at the Jean Bart, who was in the harbor, 16 miles away, the USS Massachusetts. And she got hit a couple of times and lost their air conditioning, which gave us a giggle. And we took the Massachusetts back to Boston. Now, Boston was the destroyer yard, but they had 2 huge dry docks. And even after the war, a couple of commercial, these big, gigantic pleasure ships, there was only place they could go and get hauled out and have their propellers changed or whatever the need be. After North Africa, we ended up being in the North Atlantic on patrol, got pulled away to run down to Cape Hatteras because Cape Hatteras, they were torpedoing merchant ships one a night. And the merchant ships, in shallow water, the submarines would lay down, and if you passed, they'd torpedo you. And that was somewhat interesting. Part of my responsibilities were for the crew that handled all the dip charges. And I can remember going into Reykjavik Iceland and going ashore with a work party to load trucks that they had loaned us to replenish the depth charges that we had dropped in the Pacific. Specifically, depth charges we had were 600 pounds of TNT for the stern racks, 300 pounders for the K guns that would fire on each side. We had 8 K guns, we had 5 torpedoes and 1 mount, torpedo mount between the stacks. We never fired the torpedoes in anchor, but it did have test shots that we had to go out after we fired them. It was very unique. One of the exercise heads that went on after the torpedo had run its course would release through valves and so forth air, and the torpedo would come in, and we would go out and hook on it with a line, and if you tied it down to a strong point and get going, and once the coxswain had speeded up, the torpedo rose up and we brought it back, and we were able to pull it out of the water back. We had chain falls that went out from the ship. And then we had a little work to do, running new up-to-date preliminary maintenance on them, etc. The depth charges were interesting, and some of those submarine attack, when we would zone on a man would pick up a contact, we would drop 12 or 15, whatever the pattern was, and part of my battle station was the firing of those and the hydraulic dropping of them off the stern. And when they went off, it was the gushing of water and so forth was astounding. And we'd kick out the lights, would all black out. The shot was so violent. We ended up going to Gibraltar, and I can remember as we approached Gibraltar, you had to get into the Mediterranean, you had to pass Gibraltar, and I can remember the Spanish from Spain on this side of the channel. They would put on big searchlights to try to detect tourists coming through, and no doubt collaborate with the Germans for that information. We went into Panama again and went through and picked up the USS Chester, one of 9 big, heavy 8-inch cruisers. And she had lost, or had a 40-foot section of her underwater, had hole, there was a hole, and they were able to shore it up, and we took her into New York.